Just a quick heads up before this video gets started. I wrote the script for this back in 2020 or 2021, but I didn't cite my sources. I'm fairly confident everything in this video is factually accurate, but I'm not 100% sure. I do apologise, so take everything with a grain of salt and enjoy the video.
Whoa, this is heavy.
Okay, so picture this. It is September of 1980. You and your best buddy have just come up with a fantastic new movie idea all about time travel. So you go to your other buddy, CEO of Columbia Pictures, Frank Price, and pitch him the idea, and he loves it. He gives you a few months to come up with two different drafts and before you take it around to different studios and producers. After countless refusals, you take it to Steven Spielberg, who shares Price's love for the story. However, you and your buddy have worked with him on 3 previous films, all of which flopped, so superstitiously you politely decline, and he understands completely and wishes you the best of luck. After 40 plus rejections, including Disney, you are pretty much ready to throw in the towel. Desperate to direct again, you pick up the first decent script that comes across your desk. Now that Romancing the Stone was such a success, excuse me. Now that Romancing the Stone was such a success, a whole bunch of studio execs want to hit you up to pick up your smash movie idea. But in the end, you go back to the person who believed in you from the start, Steven Spielberg. See, that's the thing that everyone gets wrong about these films. I think that Steven Spielberg directed them. He didn't. He produced them. He provided the funds, the resources, the opportunities for the movies to be made, but he himself didn't make them. Pretty much every creative decision, both in scripting and in shooting, was made entirely by Robert Zemeckis and Bob Gale. They spent a lot of time in the editing room coming up with some brilliant ideas for what the film could be. They would take note cards and they would, hang on, I think I found a clip of them. Yes, here's a clip of them in the editing room. Here you go.
Hey, Bob.
Yeah, Bob.
I think I got something, Bob.
Lay it on me, Bob.
What if Marty invents rock and roll?
Hey, Bob. Yeah, Bob. That's great, Bob.
Thanks, Bob.
But wouldn't we want to set that up earlier, though?
You're right, Bob. Maybe we'll have him enjoy playing it earlier, too.
Bob.
Yeah, Bob?
You're a genius, Bob.
Thanks, Bob.
No problem, Bob. Or something like that, you know. These films have amazing scripts, funny, witty, clever scripts. But I don't care about that right now. I mean, I do care about it, just not at the moment. Because keep in mind, Back to the Future was made in the 1980s, where the average level of VFX looked like this. So with this as an industry standard, how on earth did Back to the Future have such intricate effects? In the original movie, we have hand-drawn sparks and clouds made of pillow stuffing with a man shining a torch behind them. Thanks, Ken Ralston. The second movie has holograms and flying cars on handheld camera shots, as well as hoverboards and actors interacting with themselves, while the third movie, going even further, has massive explosions and flying trains. But in order to appreciate these incredibly intricate visual effects, firstly we need to talk about what the movie almost was. This is Marty McFly. You know him as Marty McFly. Bob and Bob pushed for him to be Marty McFly. However, due to some higher powers at the studio, for a while this was Marty McFly. Universal CEO Sid Sheinberg pushed for Eric Stoltz to play McFly. After seeing him in Mask, not The Mask, just Mask, apparently, he was convinced that he could play any character. Plus, Jay Fox was tied up with family ties at the time. So they shot with Stoltz for 6 weeks and they didn't like it.
In fact, there was one shot in particular that really stood out for Bob Zemeckis. It was that iconic shot where Marty McFly walks out to the Hill Valley Square and everything about it just looked lifeless. And Zemeckis just said, "Oh my God, we're making the wrong movie."
To cut a very long story short, Bob and Bob went to Spielberg, who went to Universal, to see if they could have Michael J. Fox play Marty McFly, to which he practically signed up on the spot. I mean, it's like it was his destiny. His destiny. The only catch was that the TV show filming couldn't be interrupted by the Back to the Future filming. So anytime it was during the day, he'd have to be at Family Ties. He'd then hop in a truck when that was finished, which was well into the night, drive to the Back to the Future set and film there, and catch about 3 hours of sleep on the way back to the original studio. If they wanted to do any outdoor shots for Back to the Future, that'd have to be done on the weekends. Because of this casting change, Melora Hardin, who was originally scheduled to play Jennifer, was also let go from the movie. She was about 3 inches taller than Michael was, and Zemeckis just thought it wouldn't look good on film, so she was cut. Spielberg then remembered Claudia Wells, who also auditioned for the role, got in contact with her agent, and she said she was happy to be part of the movie, so she was in. And speaking of casting changes, it feels weird to say, but Christopher Lloyd initially took the script and threw it in the trash without ever looking at it. If it wasn't for his wife, then our Professor turned Doc Brown might have been played by someone else. Your next question for $3,000 is, which of the following actors was not considered to play Doc Brown? Was it A. John Lithgow, B. Jeff Goldblum, or C. Clint Eastwood? Find out when we return. However, it wasn't just the casting that was almost wildly different. You remember this scene? Well, if the studio had an extra $6 million like they had originally planned, it would have looked a little something like this, harnessing the 1.21 gigawatts of power through a nuclear explosion. A nuclear explosion, mind you, which was originally intended to hit a fridge. Yeah, before it was a DeLorean, it was supposed to be a time-traveling fridge. It wasn't until Zemeckis questioned the logistics of this and also worried about the kids who would want to reenact this scene at home that they quickly switched it to being a car. When Ford heard about this idea, they were ecstatic and put in good money to have their Mustangs be used as the car in question. They were politely turned down, so they sent over 3 DeLoreans to special effects supervisor Kevin Pike's house to make a few replicas for different shots of the film. And finally, things were looking up. With the cast and crew finally locked in, and the past 6 weeks of filming all but thrown out, finally it was time to start work on Spaceman from Pluto. What, you don't like the title? Well, Sheinberg did. He sent a message to Bob, and Spielberg saying, hey, you should change the title to this, because going back to the future made no sense. So, in response, Spielberg sent a memo back to him in reply saying, Dear Sid, thanks for the hilarious memo, we all got a big laugh out of it. Keep 'em coming. And by the way, it was Clint Eastwood who was not offered the role of Doc Brown. The other two, but more likely Goldblum, both had their hats thrown in the ring. And also, it wasn't supposed to be Einstein the dog, either. Originally, Doc Brown's sidekick was meant to be Shemp, the chimpanzee. But finally, after months of changing pretty much everything, finally, it was time to start shooting and editing the movie for real. See, compared to the rest of the trilogy, the first film doesn't have that many special effects shots, only 37 to be precise. And because it was shot in the 80s, they didn't have things like Cinema 4D or After Effects, let alone any external plugins or digital rotoscoping. So if they wanted to do some effects, they had to be creative, relying on good old-fashioned pencil and paper. Except for pencils, it was a black marker, and they didn't use paper, they used clear acid. Just watch the clip. Wes Takahashi was in charge of supervising all of the animation, which is why we call him the animation supervisor. A member of his team would draw a black lightning bolt on a clear strip of acetate. They would then line it up against the required frame and photograph it, before flipping those lines into a negative image, going from black to white, and colouring it blue. They would then get the next frame, draw more lightning on a new piece of acetate, line it up relative to the frame before it, photograph it, invert it, and colour it. They did this for each and every frame of lightning, electricity, and fire in the clock tower scene. Although the fire had to be coloured orange instead of blue, obviously. But the clock tower scene wasn't the only one to use these hand-drawn sparks. Possibly one of the most famous scenes in the film uses hand-drawn coloured lines. But hang on, that looks too good to be true. That looks way too realistic. That's because that one is.
When this baby hits 88 miles per hour, you're gonna see some serious
This one scene is made up of 5 to 6 individual shots, seamlessly stitched together. The first thing they shot was the car driving with the camera following its movement. The camera abruptly stops when in the right position, while the car keeps driving off screen. From this moment on, the camera cannot be touched, as some of the crew members come in and lay down a gas pyro fluid mix before lighting it and moving out of shot. After the fire was captured and put out, they then called for Fox and Lloyd to come and stand in the right spots, and were told to act out the scene. In the editing room, the first shot was cut right when the camera stopped moving. The fire shot was placed right next to it chronologically, and because the camera didn't move, it hid the cut almost seamlessly, the kinds of effects used by Zach King and other modern media stars. To also help blend the cut, they continued the hand-drawn animations around the car, and even seemed to layer a reversed explosion on top of it all. The final layer, that of Marty and Doc, was the last to be added in. They took a single frame, physically cut them out, and hand-positioned them to move from off-screen to where they begin moving. If we go frame by frame, you can see they don't move until they're in the correct location, and there's even a 1-frame error that was missed. Sure, the effect wasn't perfect, but it was pretty damn near close. They're using effects back in the 80s that we still use and take for granted today. If you're wanting to stitch 2 shots together seamlessly, well then you can be an online magician. But doing it back then on small strips of actual film, that's what's impressive. But hands down, the best shot in this movie appears at the end of the film, in which the DeLorean picks up off the ground and flies through the air. Though, in order to talk about how that works, we may need to talk about the new innovations in technology brought about by the second film. But before we talk about the second film, I feel like we need to talk about Zemeckis at this point. See, he was set in his ways. He didn't want to make a Back to the Future Part 2. He didn't want to be tied down to any franchise or any genre. He didn't want to be the Back to the Future guy, which is why if you go to his IMDb page, you can... Anyway, he eventually decided to go ahead and make a second and third installment in the franchise, but only if he could direct another film in between. That idea was quickly greenlit, and he eventually very quickly whipped together a little film called Who Framed Roger Rabbit. It was basically a triple Oscar, multi-award winning movie where major cartoon characters from a variety of different competing studios appeared on screen together for the first and quite possibly last time, whilst interacting with live action shots and performers. One of those being Christopher Lloyd. But, to be fair, he did have to rush through it in order to get straight to work on Back to the Future Part 2 and 3, pretty much at the same time as each other. Okay, sidetrack over. Now it's time to talk about the new innovations in technology brought about by the second film. When it comes to making a sequel, or any sequel really, you need to make sure your casting is as consistent as possible. If your audience fell in love with one character, and suddenly they're played by a different actor in the second film, they might get upset. So before they put pen to paper, Bob and Bob had to make sure that all their cast was still on board.
And we said, well, if Michael J. Fox and Christopher Lloyd will sign on for a sequel, yes, we'll do a sequel. Because if we have Marty and Doc, we can figure a story out. If we don't have those guys, there's no movie.
Well, if you're doing it, then we're in, was the response they got. Not just from Lloyd and Fox, but from Leah, who played Lorraine, and Tom, aka Biff. They didn't get the same response from Jennifer or George, however. Due to family issues or contract negotiations, they were no longer able to be part of the franchise. So Bob and Bob had to go back to the drawing board and have another think. Well, if we've got Lorraine and we've got Biff, but we don't have George, well then those two can be together, and George is going to have to be...
No! Oh, please, God, no!
And that's easy enough, but killing off Jennifer may be a different story. Quite literally, because the sequel has to be about her and Marty's kids. So what if we just recast her? Elizabeth Shue auditioned before and she didn't get the part. Maybe we talk to her, see if she'd be willing to be on board. Thankfully she was, and they had a full cast again. Super easy, barely an inconvenience. But if we're going to the future, we're going to need some futuristic effects, which means we're probably going to have to invent some new technology. With the future imagined to have holograms, hoverboards and flying cars, there needed to be a way to make those effects come to life, either in person or digitally. But how? Well, let's start off simple. If you're wanting your actor to appear to be on a hoverboard, the easiest thing to do is just to put them on a normal skateboard. Shoot them from the waist up, maybe add some boards on the ground to make it smoother, add some sound effects in post-production, and bang, easy done. Another great way to do it is to attach a board to a car, or like a platform to a car. Not only does it keep everything nice and smooth, put the camera there as well, but it also keeps groups of actors in sync with each other as well. But if you're actually wanting to show the hoverboard hovering, you might need to add some additional rigging. Maybe try bolting your shoes to the board and hanging from a bar. That could work. You could have your actors hanging from intricate wires. That way you can show the entire person and board together. Or you could even combine them. Have your actor on a wire whilst the board is attached to something else entirely. Back before all this newfangled technology, the closest thing you could get to smooth, fluid animation was miniatures and stop motion, where you'd take a small object, take a photo of it, move it a little bit, take another photo, move it a little bit more, take another photo, rinse and repeat. But it didn't look very realistic. You were estimating roughly how much had to move between frames. There was no exact measurements. It was just done by eyesight. If you wanted fluid animation, if you want to control over the motion, then you'd probably need motion control. John Dykstra also wanted control over motion, so he, along with his ILM team, built the Dykstraflex. This was one of, if not the earliest motion-controlled camera systems, and was built mainly for the space battle sequences in another famous series of films. The Dykstraflex was so good that it won John and his team an Academy Award in the mid-70s. By the time Back to the Future was being created, however, ILM had created the Vista Cruiser. It was basically the same as the Dykstraflex, but was slightly more advanced and ran on computers. This meant it was so much easier to control the camera's position, rotation, scale, any other settings it needed. But it also had room in its memory to control other things like external lights or other props or miniatures. So you'd work out what you wanted to do ahead of time, you'd program every little element beforehand, and the Vista Cruiser would just run the calculations by itself and do it all for you. The end result is the motion looking extremely realistic and smooth, but also the added benefit of having the motion able to be infinitely repeated with perfect precision. This is great because then you can light each take differently and reshoot again and again, creating what's known as different passes. It's then easy to combine pieces of different passes together in the final printing process, which profusely helps pronounce the pigment presence of the pictures that the precisely programmed car is perfectly positioned onto in post-production. It helps match the colours of the shot a bit better. Even if they had the Ultra Key effect back then, the amount of blue reflecting onto the 5th scale DeLorean would have caused it to go transparent. This is why they would first shoot a bright pass, creating a very distinct difference between the background and the car itself, before shooting everything else against black, removing any problems with the blue spill. Okay, great, so now we have the car, and we've also shot a whole bunch of other miniature cars and street lights and other elements, including the outside of Biff's casino. But how are we going to put this into the shot? Camera tracking technology isn't really a thing yet, and each shot was filmed from a freehand crane. So how can we get it to look realistic? Simple, a transparent grid. Charles Claverdasher was tasked to use a simple grid in order to align and adjust the position of every element seen hovering in the shot by hand, frame by frame. But that's just it, frame by frame. It's great if you're wanting to move miniatures around, but people? If you want live action actors in real environments talking with themselves and don't want to put it on a tripod, then you're going to have something that can move in real time. And you're probably going to have to redesign how the split screen effect works altogether. The split screen effect has been around for over 100 years and originally was achieved entirely in camera. Originally you would block off half the lens, exposing one half of the film. You would then have to wind it back to the start, block the other half of the lens, and play out the other half of the scene. So long as the camera remained as still as possible, it would work wonderfully. A great example of this technique being pushed to its limits was a 1921 Buster Keaton film called The Playhouse. While it is a great use of the technique, I'm hesitant to say it's a great film because the, But I digress. As the split screen effect became more advanced and it was no longer having to be achieved in camera, there was still one thing letting it down. It still had to be shot from a tripod. The camera could not move. The slightest bump between takes could ruin the effect entirely, so there was no chance of a camera moving freely around a set. Zemeckis didn't want to compromise a well-shot movie with the occasional still shot just so they could clone their actors. Well, I mean, I'm sure there were motion control rigs out there. Well, yes, I'm sure they could have used them if they weren't so expensive, incredibly difficult to move, and so loud that the dialogue would have been all but useless. So is that why the ILM team made a new one then? Exactly right. They called it the Vista Glide. Didn't they already have that? Yes, they did. That was the Vista Cruiser. That is a different thing, however. That was used for the stop motion. Vista Glide is used for real actors. Can I take this next bit? Sure. Running on a modified dolly, the Vista Glide had 16 channels of control, each able to be reproduced with perfect precision. The first 8 of these channels were taken up with the device's settings. Back to you. Which included stop start, shutter, focus, zoom, tilt, pan, along with the lift and movement of the Vista Glide itself. Well, what about the other 8 channels? Well, they were free to control external elements and other props, which came in very handy when the actors needed to interact with themselves. This just sounds like the Vista Cruiser. Shut up, sorry. In order to seamlessly stitch the 2 or sometimes 3 pieces together, every moving element also had to be synchronized. It can be seen in the third movie where Michael J. Fox passes a plate to himself, but more notably in the 2015 McFly household in the second film. Every moving prop had to be recorded in real time. The best example of this is when Tom Wilson hands himself the almanac after pulling into his garage. The almanac was actually a sheet of metal painted to look like the almanac. It was then attached by a rod to a motor that would rotate it. And jumping forward to the third movie, when Seamus McFly passes Marty a plate of food, that plate was attached to a rod, much like the penguin waiters in Who Framed Roger Rabbit. This rod was later hidden by layering an empty shot on top of it. The most difficult shot to use this effect, however, was the scene where Michael J. Fox played 3 of his family members. It took 3 days to shoot this one shot, and everything that wasn't a prop had to be glued down.
Every bit of set dressing, anything that wasn't being moved had to be hot glued down with a hot glue gun. Unfortunately, the one night where we put guards around it so that nothing could be disturbed, and of course, as fate would have it, that we had an earthquake that night. Luckily, it was a small earthquake. It put the film together and we couldn't see anything, so the earthquake really didn't bother anything.
From the camera settings and movement to the props themselves, everything was being controlled by one computer, built specifically for this film. And combining shots together was much easier now as well. Normally, if you wanted to achieve a split screen effect, you'd need to have a wall or a tree or something vertical down the middle of the frame. Now these shots are identical, you can have it anywhere. You don't have to have it in a straight line anymore. You can put just a small section. See here, rather than doing a direct cut down the middle, they exposed all of this section, leaving just this little bit not exposed. The animation stand where this was all put together also had a programmable camera, meaning the shapes could be matched in place with the camera rather than doing it all by hand. They even took it one step further and had the brakes move freely throughout a scene. This allowed actors to move across each other's paths easily, as well as making the objects passed between them simple to put together. But then, right as the second movie was being finished, and the third movie was finishing its filming, something happened. It seems like there were even a handful more technological breakthroughs for the third movie. In 1989, as Back to the Future Part 2 and 3 were both in post-production, a woman by the name of Sandra Ford Cartman led the charge at ILM to push their effects to the next level, doing simple effects back then that nowadays we just take for granted, doing everything at the press of a button. Remember how I said that the hoverboards were attached to wires and rigs? Well, she was able to remove them from the scene through a process now called wire removal. Or how about in the third film where the DeLorean pops a wheelie in front of the train? Again, wires were attached to the front of the car and were just simply removed. She also worked with digital blue screen keying because there was no way to easily key Clara's dress without a variety of hue-based issues. Get it? Issues? Like issues? Because like the colour? Oh, forget it. There's one more scene I want to talk about from the third film. One scene that was done in one take. If for whatever reason it didn't work, there'd be another 4 months of writing a new ending and reshooting everything. I am of course talking about the train explosion towards the end of the film. Everything in that scene, from the train to the bridge support, was a quarter-scale model. 2 months of work riding on 2 seconds of footage.
And I actually remember I was on one of the cameras because they ran out of operators.
To be as best prepared as they could be, the crew set up 6 cameras from different vantage points in order to capture every angle of the hopefully successful crash. Thankfully, it all went according to plan. And sure, the trilogy isn't perfect. The miniature DeLorean's headlights aren't reflected here, the cap is cut off due to the split screen seam, Chernobyl Marty grows a third hand. Whoops, there's the crew. Hey, nice toss. But where's the reflection? And in the most heartwarming moment at the end of the third film, the little boy points to his... But at the end of the day, that doesn't matter. What started out as hand-drawn sparks and fiber-filled clouds had turned into manually tracked flying cars and cloned actors, turned rig removal and digital keying. Industrial Light and Magic revolutionized the way films were made, quite literally building technology from the ground up just so they wouldn't have to compromise on a well-directed, well-written trilogy. So to put it all back where we started, why is this simple scene so impressive? Well, because it seamlessly blends both digital and practical effects. The car was filmed by the Vista Glide driving off some wooden planks, hitting the tarmac before turning into the driveway with Einstein popping out. Back in the studio, a miniature DeLorean was recorded, first with a bright contrast pass, before multiple differently exposed passes were put together. This was then lined up using a grid, frame by frame, by a human in order to replicate what the car would look like if it were coming into land. So, on October 21st, Back to the Future Day, I don't just celebrate the movies themselves. I sit in awe at the extent that Zemeckis, Gale, Spielberg, the entire ILM studio went to in order to create 3 cinematic masterpieces. I appreciate the amount of thought put into each and every scene, creating the best possible version of every shot. Even going so far as to invent brand new technology just to assist with Zemeckis' grand ideas. Grand ideas about incredible effects, all wrapped up within a story that has, ironically, remained timeless.
You a legend, boy.
No, I better not.
What's wrong?
I've come to say goodbye. We both have.
Back to the Future is my comfort film, especially the second one, so I'm so glad I was able to essentially info dump everything to you. If you like this kind of content, I'm trying to do this more regularly now, so like, comment, subscribe, let me know what you would like to see me talk about in the future. In the meantime, I've made a few of these videos in the past. Here's one talking about the history of Broadway, which I think you might enjoy. And here's something else that YouTube reckons you might like as well. I don't know if you will or not, but it reckons you will. I mean, it's by me, so it probably has to be good. I think I'm done. I think that's it.